Hello everyone, we are pleased to be able to join this conference virtually. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are recording this at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. St. FX is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples. As treaty people, we must acknowledge our responsibilities to each other and to this land. My name is Norine Verberg. I'm a professor of sociology at St. Francis Xavier University.
My name is Jordan MacDonald, and I am a recent graduate of the University of Guelph's Master of Science in Capacity Development and Extension program. With insights from two community partners, Syria-Antigonish Families Embrace and Pictou County Safe Harbor, our research examines the economic transitions of refugees who were sponsored and resettled in rural communities in Nova Scotia since the 2015-16 Syrian Initiative. This research study has provided us and continues to offer insights relevant to resettlement organizations, employers, and newcomers in rural areas. For today's presentation, we will offer an introduction to community sponsorship and how our research informs the concept of holistic, two-way integration in relation to resettlement of refugees in rural communities. Critically, we argue that community sponsorship promotes newcomer-informed social change in these rural communities. Canada offers two admission pathways for refugee resettlement. Most refugees to Canada come as government-assisted refugees, or GARs. These individuals are supported entirely by government and receive resettlement assistance from service provider organizations. Private sponsorship of refugee program is the second stream through which refugees may come to Canada. It's been offered since 1976 and allows for community groups to name and resettle selected refugees. To promote the sponsorship of highly vulnerable refugees, the government created the Blended Visa Office Referral, or BVOR program, which encourages community groups to sponsor refugees designated as being in high risk and in need of resettlement. Government and the community groups enter into a matched funding arrangement to encourage this partnership. Under all streams noted, the refugee newcomer family receives 1 year of modest financial support and resettlement assistance as set out by policy. It is important to note that most of the refugee resettlement happening in rural areas is undertaken by community groups, as government-assisted refugees are settled in urban areas. Rural resettlement has increased markedly since 2015 as Canadians responded to the Syrian refugee crisis and when, through Operation Syria, 25,000 Syrian newcomers came to Canada. As this media story reflects, Syrian refugee families sponsored by community and faith groups were greeted by their sponsors at the airport. Safe to say that a learning journey began for newcomers and resettlement volunteers.
In Nova Scotia, refugee resettlement occurred in most counties, even counties with low population densities. Our study sought to learn more about the economic transitions of refugees who were resettled by community groups in rural areas of the province. This presentation is based on interviews with both resettlement volunteers and refugee newcomers. These newcomers were sponsored by 11 sponsorship groups in 6 rural communities in Nova Scotia, those highlighted on the map. We know that there has been secondary migration from the original host communities. This has mostly been from rural hamlets to close-by towns where a greater number of newcomers, services, or jobs may be found. Generally, most have stayed within the province. Of note, newcomers and volunteers continue ongoing friendships. It is clear from our conversations and personal experience with refugee resettlement that community members and refugee newcomers embark on a shared learning experience. In most cases, resettlement volunteers had no previous experience with this type of volunteer activity. Little information about newcomer families was shared in advance. Generally, all that was provided was the number of family members, ages, country of asylum, and origin. Newcomers were also unaware where they were going, simply the plane ticket with a destination. Few of them expected a 1 to 3 hour drive from the airport to the host community. Following arrival, all parties realized the significant challenges in rural areas to address all facets of settlement, from language services to housing, employment opportunities, cultural and religious supports. As the relationships progressed, volunteers and community members shifted from being solely focused on supporting newcomers to adopting advocacy roles. Based on our analysis, we frame community sponsorship as an immersive partnership between resettlement volunteers and newcomers. Volunteers seek guidance from newcomers to help them navigate their various transitions and access appropriate services and support. This includes learning about their past work experiences, their interests, personal goals, concerns, and expressed needs moving forward. Engaging in this intimate way repositions the role of volunteers and newcomers as identified by Bond and Quandrons. The deep engagement and high degree of responsibility undertaken by individual refugee sponsors repositions newcomers from vulnerable outsiders to partners in a project of collective interests.
To facilitate holistic integration, community sponsorship is imagined as an immersive and reciprocal partnership where both volunteers and newcomers change, as does the host society. Holistic integration portrays integration as a two-way street. As newcomers transition into their new community, their perspectives, identities, needs, and experiences are woven into the fabric of that very community. This concept was developed in response to criticisms of integration imagined as a one-way street, where newcomers are expected to acclimatize and incorporate themselves. Integration is multifaceted. It involves social, cultural, economic, and political immersions. Volunteers work to help newcomers gain their bearings and sense of belonging, to help newcomers feel a valued part of their community. Volunteers in our study describe themselves as partners who strive to facilitate newcomers in navigating a new national landscape. In the early days of resettlement, assistance is focused around setting people up into a home, learning about daily living, from shopping through to banking, addressing any immediate needs, settling children and youth into schools, and helping adults navigate into English classes or employment depending on their particular circumstances. Each family will have unique interests, needs, and circumstances, and learning and adapting to these is paramount. For instance, groups quickly sought to find interpretation services and access appropriate faith services.
Our data indicate that as settlement volunteers hear the needs and concerns identified by newcomers, they respond. They soon discovered gaps in available appropriate services. This led them to adopt an advocacy role to support newcomer integration. Again, this was described as a partnership of resettlement shared by newcomers and community members. Newcomers in our study described being heard by sponsors who helped them to take steps to get immersed, for example, in a career pathway. Some also indicate they felt empowered to advocate for themselves, especially as they achieved higher levels of integration. Today we wish to provide 3 examples of refugee-informed social change. The first refugee-informed change we wish to speak to is capacity building in rural areas to access EAL services. All participants noted this as being a key barrier to integration. One newcomer said in the early days of being in Canada that he stood in front of a coffee shop but couldn't go in as he didn't trust himself to have the words to say, "I want a coffee." This reflects that EAL is important for all aspects of integration. In 2016, volunteers in some areas set up and provided EAL services. Over time, many researched options and advocated for rural access across a range of literacy and learning levels. Advocacy and social change have worked to increase EAL services in the rural communities. However, it is noted that the available services still do not meet the needs and expectations of newcomers. Urban areas of the province appear better resourced with a higher number of programs and services. With learnings from COVID-19 and increased advocacy on the part of refugee resettlement groups and newcomers, some hybrid program delivery is starting to appear where rural residents can access programs remotely. In addition to new EAL services in rural areas, the introduction of the North Shore Local Immigration Partnership has implications for social change. This new local immigration partnership covers Colchester, Pictou, and Antigonish County, 3 rural counties that welcome refugees. The purpose of this federal program is to bring local partners together to find ways of creating welcoming communities for immigrants and refugees. This includes engaging employers and coordinating services. Membership includes refugee resettlement volunteers who have first-hand knowledge of service gap, and they work to include newcomer perspectives as well.
A second driver of refugee-informed social change is family reunification. Volunteers learn from newcomers that they come from a familial system where extended families are the norm and conceived as economic units, where the exchanges of resources support overall family and community well-being. Family reunification builds local cultural communities of newcomers who are from similar backgrounds and encourages newcomers to feel at home in their small rural communities. Sponsorship groups listened and facilitated family reunification. Here are some examples. Syria Anaganish Families Embrace chose to become a sponsorship agreement holder to facilitate family reunification in rural Nova Scotia. As well, Lifeline Syria Cape Breton Inverness County is now known as Inverness County Family Reunification to better reflect its changing role. We have chosen to highlight these newspaper stories for a couple of reasons. First, they demonstrate the development of networks among those involved in refugee resettlement. For instance, Fario Salah and Mohammed Eve came to Canada through World University Services of Canada, arriving in their early 20s and presumably leaving their families behind in refugee camps where they had spent most or all of their lives. They connected with sponsorship groups in their local areas, one through employment and the other as a volunteer doing interpretation. It is often assumed that the family reunification provides avenues for more privileged refugees, putting more vulnerable persons in peril. From a newcomer perspective, their families are in dire, precarious situations and as vulnerable as any other.
We identify starting a business and making employment transitions as a refugee-informed social change. As business owners, employers, and employees, newcomers have changed the landscape of schools, health services, and a wide range of other workplaces. They have started many new businesses such as full-service restaurants, upholstery services, and home improvement companies, and they have joined the labor market as co-workers in healthcare, construction and maintenance, manufacturing, and many other roles. Their economic transitions have involved intensive and ongoing conversations about economic dreams and hopes. For most, it has involved an uphill battle to gain English language skills, a very real battle to gain these skills. As they traversed this landscape, they did so with guidance, encouragement, and support of community sponsors, service providers, volunteers, and employers. The introduction of more and better EAL services and the innovative programs introduced by ISANS, often facilitated by the sponsorship groups, is a part of this change. Schools, universities, and some colleges found ways to link EAL to training and employment and address credential recognition and certification.
It is important to recognize that there are still a number of challenges faced by newcomers to rural areas. There are still improvements to be made in the delivery of EAL programs in rural areas and the integration of EAL programs into employment skills training opportunities. Family reunification via PSR requires sponsorship groups to fundraise the full financial cost of resettlement. This can place a limiting effect on the ability of groups to support all aspired reunifications. Literacy, education, and workplace skills training remain a challenge, with ongoing advocacy being undertaken to address specific needs in communities.
In summary, community sponsorship, when structured as resettlement partnership, facilitates refugee-informed change.
Thank you for listening to our presentation today. We hope you have found our initial findings to be thought-provoking. We welcome the opportunity to discuss this further with you when we meet in September.